happy to welcome everyone to the latest in our free and equal series of discussion meetings. And very glad that you have joined us today, and we hope to see a few more people join in. People have been straggling in a bit with the first 5 to 10 minutes of the program, but we'll get started because we have an interesting agenda and some very distinguished speakers. So really just to say thank you for the excellent discussion last time, which is, focused on the COVID challenges and how in the extreme conditions of COVID for some people, how we could come together to support the most vulnerable groups. We'd like to build on that experience of that excellent discussion in today's discussion on really homophobia and elections. We have elections coming, and now that the Georgian parliament has passed the last version of the electoral law, I think we see a pretty straight line to the elections in October. So they are coming. And I think we have seen here in Georgia, but also in other countries, disturbingly across Europe, the use of homophobia as a rallying cry, or the use of homophobic discourse as an electoral strategy. So that's obviously something we would like to combat in Georgia. And those of you who are watching the Polish presidential elections will have been horrified by really the ruling party's arguments that gender ideology is worse than communism, and these people don't deserve human rights. So quite extreme statements from what is an EU member state, and what used to be more of an exemplary democracy than we see now. So we've seen also some very bad examples in Georgia over the past several elections, particularly from extreme right parties and also from the church, but not excluding the mainstream parties, although I think we can agree that things have improved somewhat in recent years. So we want to really focus on two topics. One is sort of how to fight this homophobic discourse, but the second is how to build alliances where possible with political forces that support LGBTI rights, or at least can be persuaded not to oppose them so vocally. I'm very pleased to be joined today by a special guest. So we have the ambassador of Israel to Georgia, Mr. Ron Hidor, with us, and he has arrived in Georgia at the inopportune moment of January 2020, so arriving just in time to be locked at home by the COVID crisis, but not a stranger to Georgia, and a big friend of LGBTI rights, as Israel is as a country. So we're very pleased to have him with us today, and I will turn over to him in a moment, but I did want to introduce our speakers today. So we have Anna Abashidze here as our chair, our moderator. I'm very happy to have you on board again in your skilled hands. And then as our guest speakers, we have Conor O'Dwyer, who is Associate Professor in the Department of Political Science and the Center for European Studies from the University of Florida, where he teaches classes in comparative and European politics with an emphasis on post-communist Europe. And I think his research is particularly intriguing for us because it looks at how and when European integration influences domestic politics in Eastern Europe, and in particular the interaction between EU norms and post-communist legacies in the field of gay rights. And here in Georgia, we have had this experience of having sort of LGBTI rights often dismissed as something imposed, together, or as a condition, unacceptable condition coming with EU accession or EU integration. So it'll be interesting to hear his views. And our second speaker is Mr. Nikita Sleptsov, who is from the Department of Political Science at the University of Alberta in Canada, where he's a researcher. And he's from Russia originally, and his research focuses on the use of homophobic discourse as a political strategy, for I think crucially relevant for our discussion today. And finally, again with us, our friend Biljana Ginova, who is a noted activist from Macedonia, covering also the Balkans and Turkey. Biljana has been working in this field for over 15 years. Biljana was a member of the steering board of the Equal Rights Association for the Western Balkans and Turkey. And Biljana took part also in the Outspoken campaign that I think was very successful campaign by UNDP to give a human face to LGBTI, to the movement and to people from the Western Balkans. So we're delighted Biljana can be with us again. Biljana's insights were invaluable last time and very, very practical. So with that, I would, before turning over to Anna, turn over to our friend, the ambassador of Israel, Ran Gidor, for a few of his opening observations. And really, thanks again, everyone, for joining us today. We're delighted to have this space for discussion, and look forward to some insights on, I think, a topic that is very, very worrying across the region and has been worrying for a long time in Georgia, but perhaps we have a chance now to turn some corners, and let's be hopeful. So with that, I would turn over to His Excellency, Mr. Ambassador of Israel.
Thank you very much, Louisa. Can you hear me? Yeah, excellent. Perhaps I will come closer to the camera. So thank you, Louisa. Thank you very much for inviting me to take part in this. I'm really touched and honored. And secondly, apologies for the fact that I will not be able to stay for more than 30 or 40 minutes due to previous commitments. LGBTI has been a core part of the Israeli diplomatic agenda for more than a decade now. And both in New York and Geneva and elsewhere, Israel is a member of at least two very prestigious forums. One is the ERC, the Equal Rights Coalition. It's a group of 70 like-minded nations that was created by Argentina and the UK back in 2016. It's a very loose kind of organization that involves, as I said, like-minded governments and civil servants. And we initiate all sorts of diplomatic activities, public outreach. We coordinate position papers and stuff like that. And we achieve results on the ground, both in countries where the LGBTI issue is still a burning one, and in multilateral fora. Then we're also a core member of the LGBTI group, diplomatic group in New York, where we build coalitions and together we push through resolutions with sometimes quite controversial or groundbreaking text. Now, the reason why I think the Israeli experience is relevant to Georgia, there are several reasons for that. And it has to be said that we're not resting on our laurels. We eliminated homosexuality from the criminal code only as recently as 1988. So Israel, within a very short period of time, moved from one extreme, the extreme of being relatively backwards on LGBTI issues, to the forefront, the avant-garde of the international community. And yet, our experience, I think, is relevant to Georgia for three particular reasons. The first one is that we are not quite there yet. Israel has a dichotomy between a very liberal, very open-minded, very cosmopolitan segment of the population, which is concentrated around Tel Aviv. Tel Aviv is considered to be the Amsterdam or San Francisco of the Middle East. We have one of the world's biggest prides. Every year, 250,000 people take part in the Tel Aviv Pride. But then only 60 kilometers away, 45 minutes by bus, we have Jerusalem, our capital, where the much more conservative, much more religious part of the population are concentrated, and the mentality gaps are enormous. So when I look at Georgia and I look at the difference between the kind of people that you meet in the center of Tbilisi, who go to bars and restaurants and clubs, and they're, of course, they're very open-minded and egalitarian and everything. And then 1 kilometer away into the suburbs, you meet people with completely different mentality. So we have this situation in Israel, and this is something we're still battling with. The second reason why I think the Israeli experience is relevant to Georgia is because of our overwhelmingly pro-Western orientation. Just like Georgia, for decades, Israel has aspired to join all the Western international fora. And we want to harmonize our legislation, our civil society organizations with the model of Europe. The third reason why our experience is relevant is because, just like Georgia, a huge part of our population are religious. Even many of the liberal and non-homophobic Israelis are still religious. In Georgia, overwhelmingly, the population are religious, and this is why they take their moral code not only from civil society or the legislation, but also from religious scriptures, which is our experience as well. So the way we have, if I had to very, very briefly summarize our experience in terms of moving forward so rapidly over such a short period of time. Well, we focused on three levels. First one is legislation. Of course, removing any kind of homophobic bias from our legislating book. And I think Georgia has come a long way in that respect. The problem in Georgia, as far as I understand, and I've been here for only 6 months, is not so much legislation, but lack of enforcement. So legislation is very important, obviously, because it gives all of us the tools for moving forward. Second level is education. Now, education has to start from a primary school age, and in places like Tel Aviv, where we have so many single parent families or single sex parents, then it's very important that kindergarten teachers, primary school teachers, inculcate from a very early age the fact that there's absolutely nothing wrong or unusual in the fact that your friend at school has two fathers or two mothers. You can't start too early in that respect. But education goes on forever. It doesn't stop. It goes on in a secondary school level and academia, of course. And thirdly, no less importantly, is the public outreach. We need to constantly generate high-profile events that are symbolic and shatter all kinds of barriers. And I just want my last comment, I don't want to take up too much time, an example that I had in my previous place of posting, which was Yaoundé, Cameroon in West Africa. As I'm sure you know, in most African countries, homosexuality is still considered a criminal offense. Now, when I arrived there 3.5 years ago, the Israeli embassy in Yaoundé, just like Tbilisi or anywhere else, was at the forefront of the pro-LGBTI campaign. But we had to do it very delicately and very discreetly in order to not violate the laws of the host country. So we started initially by organizing roundtable discussions and posting pictures on the embassy's social media platforms. Now, I have to tell you that initially, even my Cameroonian colleagues working with me at the Israeli embassy were absolutely horrified. I had to warn them not to make any sly comments, not use any disparative body language, and they made no secret of the fact that they disapproved of the agenda that I was leading. A mere 3-4 months later, not only did they stop disparaging our activity, but they came up with proactive suggestions on how to do it better. I also noticed that on the embassy social media, whereas initially every time we posted LGBTI-related picture or status, we would get maybe 2 or 3 supportive comments and 200 critical comments. After 6 months, the proportions reversed, and by the time I finished my term in Yaoundé 3.5 years later, we got overwhelming support from people who initially were against it simply because they had no first-hand knowledge or familiarity or even understanding of what LGBT was all about. So it can be achieved, it can be done, and sometimes what we need to do is take provocative action, flag up the activities that we do. It plays a hugely important role. Now, in this respect, the fact that I represent a country which is considered the Holy Land for the 3 monotheistic religions, that is hugely significant, because I remember both in Cameroon and already here in Tbilisi, many of the people that I've met, when they hear that a diplomat representing the land of Jesus Christ or the land of the Jewish prophets or Prophet Muhammad who visited Jerusalem, according to the Quran, that is a weighty subject, so we can harness religion in order not to reject LGBTI, but in order to support LGBTI. And, religion, any kind of religion has place for everyone, regardless of sexual orientation, of course. So this is very briefly, and once again, I apologize that I can't stay more than half an hour. Thank you.
Thanks so much for joining us, Mr. Ambassador. And it really is such a pleasure to hear your thoughts and insights. And I think a lot of us, have in our heads this very conservative image of Israel. So it's good to hear, first of all, that you are such a progressive force, but second, that you have seen such change over such a short period, because I think we would also like to see change over a short period, and we hope that you will join us in the future as well. So thanks for giving us some of your time today, and we'll look forward to future encounters and hearing more stories, both from Israel and from Cameroon, which also I think is a surprising a surprising story of progress there. So with that, I would really, again, welcome everybody and turn over to our very able moderator, Anna Abashidze, to handle the rest of the program. And I will be listening with keen interest to the discussion. So thanks everybody again. Thanks, Mr. Ambassador, and let's have a great discussion.
Thank you. Დიდი მადლობა. ბატონო.
Sorry, just before you start, ერთხელ კიდევ ვინც ახლა შემოგვიერთა. ან შენ თქვი, ან მე, როგორც გირჩევნია.
Okay, for the English, the two შემეშლება გამისწორე ტექნიკურად. For the English, you need to put English button. If you see the interpretation on your screen, below of the screen, there is an English, Japanese, and off. For the interpretation, you need to put English, right, Hatia?
Yes.
Okay.
Who wants and who speaks English for them? For Georgian speakers, switch to Japanese. If you don't understand English, yes.
გამარჯობათ, მოგესალმებით ყველას.
I'd like to greet you, welcome everybody. We'll speak in Georgian and interpretation will be provided. And from the very beginning, she extends gratitude for interpretation. Thanks to organizers at the first place for inviting me. You have a really interesting first meeting. This is first for me. Thank you very much for engaging me in this process. It's really interesting. It's really important. So the topic we're gonna discuss today is the most timely and relevant for Georgia, especially for Georgia and our guests, especially the foreigners, representatives of academy and practitioners and Georgian representatives who are with us. Also, I would like to welcome all of them who managed to choose proper strategies for combating political homophobia. So we call this way in different countries, not just in Georgia, but at the same time, we understand that the contexts are absolutely different, and in general, the situation has different aspects. Thus, today, I have pleasure to share my opinion with you regarding the situation in Georgia with strategies of political parties. What can we say that is changed recently, positively, negatively, and after this we'll try to moderate. We are a bit late, and I'll do my best to limit myself about 10 minutes for sharing my opinion, and then what is absolutely important, I will allow our guests to share their experience with us. Thanks a lot to His Excellency, Mr. Ambassador. It's absolutely important to have this information for parallels, because these parallels are absolutely relevant for Georgia in many directions, especially when we speak about the need for education and access for equality, and so this beginning of the discussions could be the way for success in our country. Laws we have are really wonderful, but enforcement is a problem in most cases. Thank you, Luisa. Thank you, Ashim. Start our meeting. This meeting has a particular role, and if we manage this today, if we manage to achieve this goal today, so it is on one hand to share the experience, which is half a job. I mean, it's really valuable to hear the experience which other countries have, and second and very important is to agree and or manage to agree that we need joint and common visions. If we agree that for us it's absolutely crucial to respond to the challenge, then it will become possible to continue discussing in detail. Now, regarding the Georgian context and situation in Georgia, in the beginning, I will make the statement that I did not investigate or study in depth this topic, and whatever I say there is my observation based on my activity, and on the other hand, my experience as of a citizen, one particular person living in Georgia, one voter. In general, the studies in this regard are more
რომ დაწყებულია თუ
that's
მობა და ჩემს
comprehensive
ქართულ კოლეგებს ვთხოვ რომ მოგვიანებით დაამატონ თუ გამორჩა რა ინფორმაცია რომელიც რელევანტურია და ჩვენ უნდა გავაზიაროთ დღეს. პირველ რიგში როგორი სიტუაციაა პოლიტიკური ჰომოფობიის
what is the situation in the first place? What is the political situation in regard to integration of a political at the first glance, it will be really too difficult to um, to say that mainstream parties, strong parties operating in Georgia are engaged in homophobia. This is not good. It will not let us say that on the values political parties agree and these values correspond to constitution of the country, but on the other hand, it will not let us to say that these parties are absolutely discharged of homophobia because from different members there could be some homophobous comments, and on the other hand, we can say that they try to go from anti-homophobic opinions, and their actions mean that there is no agreement on these issues. However, we can say that compared with the previous years, I mean here previous elections, people could much so they were speaking with more pleasure, more pleasant issues, and these are basically topics which were against equality, and some groups were really oppressed, and so in some cases gender equality and such topics different with the different thematic issues. I need to say that I don't think that I am mistaken that the second sector is stronger, especially organizations who have different who work on rights of people of different identities. So we can start discussions on these issues and say that these issues are associated with achievements, and but according to my assessment today, community organizations and non-governmental organizations are much stronger, and they somehow made their footprint on political agenda would say so. And at the same time, we would like to highlight role of media and time by time where media expressed some progressive ideas. It was pretty well demonstrated some period ago when in Georgia unsuccessful, and when there was unsuccessful attempt of one of newly established political organizations to somehow attack LGBT community, and when they said that they somehow rejected absolutely general truth while saying that LGBT rights are not violated in Georgia. And after that, after me, my colleagues will be at that additional talks took place and additional discussions took place, which is new and which gives me hope. So previously, political parties were making propagandistic were making propagandistic statements. Then absolutely happily they used to go to their agendas. But this time they had to apologize. This time they even started cooperating, transformed in cooperative format their cooperation with community-based organization. All this indicates that today it's not that easy to offend or insult LGBT people. It's not that easy to treat this group. It's not, but it was easy. It was very easy to insult and have careless attitude towards LGBT people. But now it's not the case. For example, we know in past 10 years ago, 5 years ago, agenda of political parties was full of this content, but today this is empty of this content is not the case because the public does not demand for such a content, and political parties change their rhetorics. So I would like to say my opinion regarding the general public. I think that people does not pay much attention to such topics. Moreover, they scare of political parties, whether they will openly support LGBT, the rights of LGBT people publicly, or maybe they will appear in front of voters with such ideas is not that dangerous anymore. They want us to make believe. So in previous elections, parties somehow based their used to base their whole agenda on homophobic values or homophobic decisions. And before the elections were finished, there was an expectation that these people with such campaigns of such content even might develop majority in Parliament of Georgia. But that never happened, and the government, the population of Georgia didn't support such parties, and it's really important. So when political parties tell us that our resistance is caused by the wish of the voter, I think that we could be suspicious in correctness of their words, and this provides us grounds to decide to work more with political parties. We by all means need to highlight the role of international community. In our country, democracy is a bit fragile. Regrettably, many processes depend on international cooperation. And here we mentioned aspirations of Georgia. Uh, to membership of different international organizations. You know that association agenda and agreement are strong tools for strengthening democracy in Georgia. But besides, in Georgia operate the agencies in different mandates with the help of which we so the government of Georgia pays forced attention to that. We are really grateful for that, and that it is a successful way is approved by gender rights, women rights, gender equality ideas. 5, 7 years ago, even gender equality ideas uh, uh, required a very serious effort of our international partners to be supported here in Georgia. But today's situation is absolutely different, and this change is positive, actually. So I would like to highlight that in normal situation, there are something new is implemented in much easier way, but much smoothly, But when so these processes take lives of people and life quality of life and degree of happiness is so low, we do not have time for waiting for decades changes of values and to be so quiet and calm. So my good friend Roma says that sometimes people change laws, but sometimes laws change people. I know that this is quite painful process, but in fact we have to use laws to force people to change their behaviors. So the challenges we talked about, positive signs. I think that today political spectrum never than ever is ready to change its rhetorics, but at the same time there are some challenges about which we have to speak. The most important on which we have to agree is development of joint vision, joint approaches. What kind of strategies could be used by civil sector and community led organizations in Georgia? If we cannot manage to agree on basic topics, in fact, this somehow facilitates and accelerates political homophobia and maintains the environment which we all want to change. So, at the first place, we need to agree on joint strategies and find common points. I think that this should be one of the main goals. Increase of support in any case is one of the key directions. And on this issue, when Georgia, when taking into consideration context of Georgia, it's less expected that critical mass of population will not support this issue. We'll have to find supporters not amongst ordinary citizens who today have problem of hunger and they have to solve problem of starvation. This could we should find supporters among more liberal politicians, people having more liberal values and opinions, our international partners. Also, it's a challenge that we do not have experience of cooperation with politicians. This year, upcoming elections planned for October can fully change ruling political force. So these are very important elections. Consequently, in the agenda puts the
მაინცა და მაინც კარგი და სრულყოფილი გამოჩილება, ესე ვთქვათ, მათთან თანამშრომლობის. ამიტომ დღეს არსებითად მნიშვნელოვანია ჩვენი მეგობრების და მოწვეული სტუმრების გამოცდილება, რომლებიც დღეს ისაუბრებენ.
Absolutely important to share our guests, our international friends. We should not avoid role of church in political situation of Georgia. These two words might exclude each other, but in Georgia, this is really important. So establishments based on beliefs, Orthodox Church as the first place is one of them. Opposition group which is always against equality context, but in this context, they always identify LGBT community and gender equality. When force of religious organizations is more than of democratic government, we do not have luxury not to think about this institute. And when we speak about the strategies, we by all means need to think of strategic visions and activities with government as well as with religious organizations. And finally, in my opinion, this topic to which political homophobia is linked closely with security issue, national security, and here we by all means shall mention Russia, political weapon of which, political tool of which, according to our assessment in Georgia, one of the tools is focus on rights of minorities. And if we observe when do they appear, whenever there is political crisis in the country, in parallel, so-called far-right groups come in action against progressive movements. And in this respect, it's very important to take into consideration that quite often such protests are repressed by the government based on motivations for national security, but with this they increase supporters among population of Georgia. For example, Tbilisi Pride experience is very interesting, and later they will tell us when we tried to arrange the pride, we all remember the rhetorics regarding this particular activity as if this behavior was contradicting to national interests of the country. And in this respect, it's very important to take all this to envisage all this in strategies. I think that we should agree with the will of politicians to be quiet if we do not want to cause more problems, but even more in reality of Georgia, it's there are some beneficiary actions. So instead of sitting quiet, I think that we should have demands, more decent demands, and this gives us, this already demonstrated good results. One of the good results was this newly established organization which tested this strategy and was not successful. That unsuccessful, that important members, some of the important members of the party left the party. I don't remember, I can't recall any such examples, so such march living of the party. If you remember something, please correct me. But this means that standards of values are changed, are improved. Media, activists, international partners work hard, and all thanks to all these values are changed. So our partners provide not just financial but also intellectual support as well. Okay, I did my best to be brief, but
Yes.
anyway, I will stop now. And I apologize for being so long. And now with great pleasure. So let's listen to all the speakers, record the questions, and during the discussions, let's go back to particular speakers if you are comfortable, if you don't mind such a. So Mr. Gonor, who really has a really serious experience, and this experience covers countries not just of Central Europe. I know that he has done serious work in post-communist countries in terms of political homophobia. When we speak about strategies, it's absolutely important to know what was the way passed by politically similar countries, and what were the lessons learned, and how could we more quicker and more effectively act. This, I believe, is the best opportunity for Georgia to avoid mistakes which might be made by other countries. I would like to greet you. Thank you very much for being with us. And now the floor is yours. With great pleasure, I listen to you and write down all your information.
Okay, thank you very much, Anna, if I may. Thank you all of the organizers for inviting me. Thank you all of the participants. It's really a pleasure for me to be here today virtually. Um, Maybe someday it can be in person. I would love to go to Tbilisi, but for now, we'll make do with Zoom. I'm not an expert in Georgian politics. My area of study is post-communist politics more generally, and in terms of country expertise, it's more East Central Europe. But I thought I could maybe try to just talk about some lessons based more generally on experience of other post-communist countries. And I know that time is short, and I'll really try to limit myself to 10 or so minutes, and hopefully we can have a good discussion in later parts. I also look forward to hearing from my colleagues who will be speaking after me. But I'd like to focus on three main areas. One is just to kind of think about Georgia in terms of the broader context of post-communist countries. Is it what can we compare it to? Should we compare it with former Soviet countries, or do we think about East Central European countries? Second major or larger point I'd like to focus on is, are there models for LGBT movements that might be helpful for Georgian activists as they're working within their own country on this issue. And then the last is basically thinking about political homophobia and anti-gay backlash. To think about, since that's always a possibility, especially in a lot of countries around the region, when does it occur, and what are its consequences? And that's a huge topic, but at least we can kind of maybe think about some aspects of it. So first of all, to think about situating Georgia, I think, where does Georgia in terms of LGBT empowerment and sort of the political status of LGBTI individuals, where does it fit within the broader region? And I think probably all of you are familiar with the legacy of communism, and I tend to come at this issue in this region by really kind of emphasizing the fact that in general, post-communist countries tend to be less tolerant of issues to do with sexual orientation and homosexuality than non-post-communist countries. There's something about the legacy of communism that is very difficult on this issue. On the other hand, it's also true that I think there's a pretty large divergence between the trajectory of East Central European, East European countries and former Soviet countries. And a lot of that has to do with, the place of Russia and politics in Russia. But I think we could begin with sort of thinking about, where does Georgia fit in this broader context? And, some of the reasons why there's this split perhaps between former Soviet and East Central European countries has to do with the length and intensity of experience of communism, it being longer and more intense in the former Soviet states, the nature of the regime and democratization after the fall of communism, and then also I think the degree of connection with the West and Europe. And so all of these things may explain why you see a kind of divergence between, former communist countries. And what I did, first of all, and I won't take very long with this, but I'm going to try here to share the screen. I just, I'm going to show you, hopefully this will work. Can everyone see this?
Yes.
Okay. I just, I took a measure which is available online. I encourage you all to look at it. This thing called the Varieties of Democracy Project, and they look at sort of aspects of democracy cross-nationally and over time around the world. And I just picked out one indicator they have, which is the distribution of power by sexual orientation. And I won't go into how they exactly code that. We can talk about that if you like. But basically, you have a scale here that, the higher up the scale, sort of the more equitable distribution of power by sexual orientation. So the more LGBTI friendly the political situation is, the higher score you get on this graph here. And I put East Central European countries as an average. I put Russia as an average, going back to say 1990 up to the last data, and Georgia. And you can see here that Georgia, up until about 2002 was very close to Russia. And then after that point, it seemed really to have kind of moved more to the level of East Central Europe. So I think it makes sense. And this is a very blunt measure, but I think it makes sense to think about the lessons of East Central European countries when talking about Georgian politics and this issue, which is what I'm going to do. So as kind of justification for that, for the next part of what I'd like to do, which is kind of talk about models for LGBT movements and the relationship between LGBT movements and political parties elsewhere in the political spectrum, to draw on the experience of two countries in East Central Europe that I know best, which are Poland and the Czech Republic. So I'm going to turn off the screen sharing here. So, what does the lessons, what are lessons from East Central Europe? And I'd say the first thing that kind of I could say based on my research of looking at how LGBT movements have evolved and emerged since about 1990 onwards in East Central Europe, is that first of all there's a variety of experiences. So it's not that there's this one kind of path that post-communist countries follow. There's quite a lot of differences between countries, and I think maybe some of these can be relevant to Georgia, and those of you who know Georgian politics much more than I do, much better than I do, might find this. But I think I can think of at least two models based on East Central Europe. So on the one hand, I think of a kind of LGBTI movement that takes what I call like the insider approach in terms of dealing with building connections to political parties and representing this issue politically and trying to mobilize politically for rights and for equal treatment and inclusion. And I think the Czech Republic historically is a great example of the kind of insider approach. To some extent, this is a choice. To another extent, you may not have this choice based on, the situation, the domestic situation. So if we think about the domestic situation and the kind of, history of the Czech Republic, a couple of things stand out. First of all, and maybe going along with that, it tends to be less intolerant of homosexuality historically. So even under communism, when Czechoslovakia was a very hardline communist regime, it was surprisingly open regarding homosexuality. So under communism, there were in the kind of state institutions of the health system, of psychological institutes, what they called sexological institutes. There was a pretty developed network of doctors and researchers who dealt with homosexuality and also built support groups and therapy groups for LGBT people. And these actually transformed into the first gay rights groups after the Velvet Revolution, after 1989. And then during the 1990s, the Czech state was relatively supportive of these new groups. So they gave them funding through HIV awareness and prevention. And so as a result, Czech LGBT movement from quite early on was pretty well funded. It was politically connected, and it was pretty well organized. And they were very engaged politically, but the kind of engagement that they had was what they called the strategy of small steps. So they were working kind of on these small, kind of incremental improvements. They lobbied politicians directly rather than trying to kind of build their own political organizations that would sort of contest elections or keep fielding candidates. Not that there weren't attempts at times to run for elections and that, but it was really more of a kind of using this kind of network of acquaintances with politicians. They didn't try to like really build kind of mass mobilization, or they didn't try to make the issue really visible. For example, one thing I was always surprised about was that they explicitly didn't do pride parades. Even though it was a quite tolerant society, and as I said, they had a big kind of network of lobby groups, there weren't gay pride parades in Prague until memory serves. And part of this is they didn't want to kind of create public controversy. They wanted to kind of use their connections and sort of, this strategy of small steps. So Poland is kind of the opposite situation. So I think the Polish LGBT movement, if we think about it, in broad terms, it's kind of had the outsider approach. And in a way, this is where I was saying that kind of the historical details are important and the kind of contextual details are important because they didn't maybe have the chance, they didn't have the opportunity to be insiders. So they kind of had to be outsiders. As you know, it's the Catholic Church is a strong cultural and political institution in Poland, and it's rather militant in opposing gay rights. Under communism, there weren't these kinds of support groups and psychological institutes, sexological institutes that could sort of form a basis for activists after the revolution in 1989. So there wasn't like a network to build off of that you had in Czech Republic. There wasn't support through the state for HIV, AIDS prevention and information. And to the extent that there was, it kind of ironically tended to go through the church and through church-supported institutions. So the Polish movement, they were outsiders, and they didn't have these kind of connections to politicians that they could work with. And the movement in Poland went through some phases. So early on in the 1990s, it was really kind of also wasn't going for visibility. It was kind of providing services. It was kind of avoiding politics. But then around 2000, there was a big change. One new organization in particular was formed called Campaign Against Homophobia. And they tried to create visibility. They had a kind of big public awareness campaign that was controversial, having billboards across the country with same-sex couples. Poland quickly started doing pride parades. Those were very controversial. They were banned by Law and Justice Party early on. And the Polish movement also very quickly kind of linked gay rights with EU accession, which was less the case in Czech Republic. And so the result was in Poland that there were major moments of backlash, anti-gay backlash, by Law and Justice, by a party called the League of Polish Families back in the 2000s, is no longer present. And there were various moments when the social conservatives won elections, and they did so in campaigns that really made use of sort of scaremongering about, LGBT menace, etc. Um, and so they won in 2005. They won in 2015. Um, and so there were these moments when there was kind of political homophobia. But what I tried to kind of talk about in, in, in my research was kind of some of the spillover effects for the movement itself. So even though the conservatives could win elections at various points, mobilizing in part, there were other parts to the story, of course, but in part, mobilizing this kind of conservative social values, it also had some kind of benefits for the LGBT movement in Poland. So, for one, an issue that was completely invisible, was considered not worth talking about in politics, was just completely on the margins, became sort of front and center main issue in politics that people talked about a lot. And that was really new in Poland, that homosexuality was something that people talked about. It also created a huge amount of unity within the movement. So the Polish movement was quite strong because it felt kind of under attack from the outside, and so it built alliances with, in particular, the women's movement, and then also some new kind of political parties. So the third thing that happened was that, like, more liberal allies, more pro-European allies that probably otherwise wouldn't have been that interested in gay rights became kind of allies of the movement. So it, I think, in many ways, kind of helped the movement. Um, it's a complicated story. So if you think about what have the Czech Republic and the Czech movement and the Polish movement. I'm going to end here very quickly because it has been going on a very long time. What have they gotten? The Czechs have been more successful in terms of legislation. They have registered partnerships there. Um, the Polish movement does not have a lot of legislative things that it can point to, but the Polish movement is very strong, and in fact, I would say it's one of the strongest in East Central Europe. And I think that really is because this outsider strategy can be successful. And we tend to focus on elections, and we tend to focus on the homophobic rhetoric that comes up in elections. But what we forget about is the kind of counter mobilization that also occurs. And I think there's a kind of ratchet effect to these moments where the counter mobilization that achieves a new level that kind of sticks after the election, and so you build kind of incrementally over time. And so I think I'll end with that because I think I've gone on for more than I should have. So thank you for your patience. I look forward to hearing the next speakers.
პირიქით დიდი მადლობა, ძალიან საინტერესო მიმოხილვა იყო. შესაძლოა
Thank you very
გარკვეულ
much for interesting overview. There are maybe there are some similarities. We might saw some similarities, especially Georgians. But I would like to highlight that one thing could be said that without local community organizations, neither political parties can change something, even if supported by international partners or anyone else. And of course, it's impossible to make dramatic changes only based on community-based organizations. So when a political situation is changed on international level, I will go with this question to Nikita, who spoke really during our first session. He spoke, he told really interesting stories how political parties' activities are changed when they join international organizations. What could be the influence? For example, if we take example of Russia of 90s, so what could be the influence of European organizations or joining Council of Europe or joining European family? This caused positive legislative changes. So this is a possible global influence of political organizations. And on the other hand, if you could share your observations, for example, when in culture And equality is not integrity, so value of equality is not integrated in culture, but the states accept, adopt laws which then they cannot enforce. So what kind of activities are more acceptable in this case, focused on legislative changes or social changes? How we can better cause changes, global changes. So please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy and very glad to be joining you guys virtually from Canada. So I'm going to talk to you about Russia, and as a political strategy of the state, homophobia has manifested itself quite vividly in the post-Soviet space. Originating, so to speak, in Kaczynski's Poland in late 2000s, this modular practice is being used in Russia on a quite a large scale, finding itself written in the law books. Its unfolding was related to the return of Vladimir Putin to the Kremlin in 2012, who had previously held the post of the chairman of the Russian government. Intimidated perhaps by the Arab Spring ruthlessness towards former rulers and political turmoils at home, the 2012 Putin administration, which had never been particularly liberal or democratic, began tightening its grasp over society. Starting with the legislation that prohibited the adoption of Russian kids, first to the United States citizens and later to all Europeans whose countries allow gay marriages, Russia's parastatal media presented this campaign, so to speak, not only as a sign of Russia's returning might, but as a turn to a turn to a different sort of set of cultural values. We are no longer Europe, TV anchors were telling people. This message found fertile grounds within the majority of Russians whose animosity towards LGBTQI individuals has always been high. The state seemed to be sending a clear message articulated by one of the media propaganda voices. Hearts of gay people have to be burned and buried. Thus, gay people become one of the state's enemy as culturally different agents of the West, whose nature and political agenda is set to corrupt Russianness, whatever this word may mean. It is worth mentioning that the unfolding of political homophobia in Russia was accompanied by other legislative and political measures aimed at changing Russia's political position vis-à-vis the countries of Western Europe and North America in particular. Laws that reduced the number of exchange programs between Russian and American school students, laws that marked NGOs that receive international funding, foreign agents, and other legislative initiatives gradually reduce the number and the ability of LGBTQI organizations to operate in Russia. The culmination of explicitly homophobic legislation was the federal law called, quote, for the purpose of protecting children from information advocating for a denial of traditional family values, unquote, that unanimously passed the State Duma, the Russian parliament, on June 30th, 2013. The law became known as the Gay Propaganda Law or the Anti-Gay Law. It mainly faced criticism from abroad, not from inside the country, unfortunately. Inside Russia, only a small number of democratically oriented organizations and human rights groups opposed the legislation and tried to appeal it, but did not succeed. The legislative measures established social disparity in traditional and non-traditional relations by prohibiting public display of affection between same-sex partners, which contradicts the principle of non-discrimination of international human rights law. Unable to spark the economy's growth, the Putin administration needed a political agenda that would attract the majority of Russians. And this was the all-familiar antagonism with the West. And political homophobia was one of its not-so-new vital tools. Why not so new? Because homophobia as a political mechanism has had its dark history in the Soviet Union, where from 1934 until 1993, homosexuality was punishable by up to 5 years in prison. Decriminalization of homosexuality was also a more political act than a humanitarian one. Flush with victory in the Cold War in the early 90s, Western European countries failed to fully engage Russia in the democratic process and the work of European institutions. Weak ties between the European institutions made it unfeasible to influence the Russian government on gay rights issues. However, some European institutions, such as the Council of Europe, in the early 90s demanded decriminalization of homosexuality before it could actually welcome Russia into its ranks. As a response to that, back then the Yeltsin administration in 1993 excluded so-called mужеложество, which means man laying with man, or sodomy, from the Code of Criminal Offense. It was not excluded from the list of mental illnesses until 1998, just like in the case with decriminalization of homosexuality. It was done quietly, without proper information campaign among Russians, among the population, in the media. Decriminalization, however, did not lead to the destigmatization of Russian gays and lesbians. The growing visibility of sexualities in the early 2000s on Russian TV and the streets of big cities quickly ignited a feeling of societal homophobia within the population. Homosexuality in particular was seen by people as an import, as a direct effect of Western influence. Such widespread attitudes supported the Putin administration's effort to pose LGBTQ Russians as a scapegoat. The examples of this are plenty, unfortunately. One only needs to search in Google for homophobia in Russia to find pages of news reports from public actions with scarce LGBTQI individuals on squares of St. Petersburg or Moscow being arrested, beaten by the police, or a multitude of open court cases against LGBTQI activists posting information on their social media and being sued for it and being put to prison for it. At the same time, the state launches political homophobia campaigns on TV with short videos showing gay families as undesirable or gay men as not fully human. The current campaign for constitutional amendments in Russia is an additional example of it. State homophobia in Russia is being used to create a sense of national unity in the face of the other, portrayed as the collective West, with its values, discourses, and policies. The regional anti-gay propaganda laws that were finalized by the enactment of the federal law in Russia banning so-called propaganda of non-traditional sexual relations among minors follows from the idea that the Russian nation is a heterosexual one and homosexuality is non-Russian. However, homosexuality is not simply non-Russian, it's Western. This anti-Western homophobic discourse, produced by politicians, has existed within public consciousness since the Soviet times. Accompanied by societal homophobia, the government scapegoats LGBTQI rights activists within the country. Any attempts by international groups and governmental bodies from abroad to point out government misconduct is criticized as the desire to influence the internal politics of the country, undermine the foundation of its constitutional regime, and violate the democratic will of the Russian people. This strategy is used primarily as an excuse for non-fulfillment of decisions from the International Court of Human Rights in confrontation with the UN decisions to protect the rights of LGBTQI people in Russia. Domestic audience perceives it as a sign of strength rather than weakness. The government also uses such state homophobia to divert public attention from domestic problems, which are plenty. Blaming the West for the struggling economy is currently one of the main strategies that the Russian government employs. In this situation, Russian gay people are shown as Western agents employed to destroy family values and national identity. The current Russian policy, it seems, is to build a nation based on the conservative heteronationalism, characterized by stable gender norms, traditional family values, the aggressive rejection of non-normative sexuality, and opposition to the West. That approach, in my opinion, helps to stabilize the regime during difficult times of international instability. That would be all. I'm happy to answer questions and participate in the discussion, hopefully.
Didi Madhuba,
Thank you very much. It's of course unpleasant to hear such information in regrettably all this happens in Russia. Russia is our neighbor. Of course, with Russian people, we would have with pleasure good relationship. Due to political decisions, we are somehow separated. So I'm very sorry to hear how politicians use political homophobia. You mentioned that it's not just for maintenance of internal power, but it is a tool for maintenance of global power, which of course makes even more difficult combating it. Of course, in this respect, we are not happy to have this comparison, but still, in Georgia, we have a bit better situation, and in fact, we might wish that this could be one of the topics in future which might unite somehow these countries and bring closer. If Georgia achieves success, this could be positive message to our Russian friends, activists who are fighting inside of the country or immigrated but still continuing to fight for human rights in Russia. I wish you success to you, to your friends, to your family members who are in Russia, and we wish success to our countries, to both. Now I want to switch to practical aspects. So how can we translate these topics into practice, the way to, so I want to apply to Diana. You have a really good and rich experience. So it's again a member, neighbor of Georgia, and you are activist. You have experience about Macedonia as well. You are activist. You are one of the founders of movements, and this meeting is attended by so many activist people who are developing the agenda in Georgia. And if we can speak about something positive, it's thanks to people listening to us right now, and your perspective for us is really, really valuable for us. Please, we are listening to you.
Hi, hello. Thank you for inviting me again. It's nice to see familiar faces. I hope I will not bore you seeing me so often. And the other thing that I wanted to say is that in this kind of events, I think it's the best when you speak the first, because you have prepared some speaking notes and you will just share them. Now, listening all of you, and you all raised so important issues, I want to talk about everything that you've touched upon. So my plan is to start talking. I will try to keep in the framework of 10, maybe 11, 12 minutes, and then we will see how it will go from there, and maybe I will continue in the discussion. Listening what you have shared, both Nikita and Conor, I must say that in Macedonia the situation was very different. And even though I was not planning to talk about history, but just to touch upon few points, I think it's important. Same. In Macedonia, same-sex, the sexual intercourse between men was criminalized, only between men, not between women. And it was decriminalized in 1996 due to the application in Council of Europe, and the same as you shared in your speech, without any public campaign or anything. It was quietly, no one knew about it except some officials in some office. The first LGBT organization established in 2001 without mentioning any word of LGBTI or sexual orientation or gender identity, nothing. It was Center for Human Rights, and blah blah blah. So they also started quietly in that kind of in that manner. The next important point in the history is 2004, when Macedonia was preparing the application for European Union. At that time, the Social Democrats were in power, and when they filled the application, in the section of sexual and gender minorities, they stated that in Macedonia there are no LGBTI people. So this is not talk about. This is something that we do not talk about publicly very much, because Brussels returned the application. The Ervan Fere, the ambassador of the time from European Union, intervened, and they changed the application immediately. Quick research was done, so they put data that yes, we have LGBTI people, we just want to enter European Union. But this was again very quietly. This was not in the public, this was only in this some circles, let's say. However, in 2006, they lost the elections to the Demo-Christian political party due to corruption, of course. And the Demo-Christian political party won the election on the European card. So they say we are all pro-EU. And we, because we are not corrupted as these social democrats, we will do that fast. We will invest in the economical growth, we will fight corruption. In 2008, Macedonia did not enter into NATO, and this political party abused that to start building a nationalist agenda. Mm-hmm. But it was not only nationalist and ethnocentric agenda, it was also the narrative of healthy nation. Mm-hmm. It was the family values, Christian values. And all that narrative was imposed very, how can I say, forcefully and very abruptly through the media that was fully controlled by them, through the state institutions, through the state politics, on every level. And even we had more or less good law on abortion, which was from former Yugoslavia left in the country. They changed the law on abortion. And when the feminists would react, they had like language, we will not listen to this LGBTI, this is not law for them. So this is just briefly to know the history. And that political party remained in power for 11 years, building autocratic regime. And for that I was talking more in the previous speech, when was it, a couple of weeks ago. So I will not go into detail what was happening then, because I shared that already. But I will just say that in that context, for us, it was impossible to enter into the system. It was impossible to find entry points within that political system for us to talk about LGBTI rights. The only possibility was, for us, the street. So we organized protests on the streets, reaction on the streets, and of course, the international community. So we would use UN mechanisms, European Commission, Council of Europe, etc., and also diplomats in the country. UN ambassador and other ambassadors. So that's how we became good friends with Luisa. But we saw an opening to work with the opposition. In these years, of course, 11 years to be in opposition, Social Democrats weakened very much. They lost their power that they had in the 90s or early 2000s. They transformed inside, they had new leadership, etc., etc. And we saw possibility to work with them because of that. And also because of another thing, and those are the political protests in the country. They took place in many years, but they were strongest in 2015 and 2016, because LGBTI activists were very vocal in that protest. And all of us who were vocal in that political protest, we had some small microcosmoses of supporters, of citizens, not because we are LGBTI, but because of the political stance against corruption, against police brutality, against violation of human rights, etc. And for Social Democrats at that moment, every small support was important for them to gain the elections, to win the elections. So we, in a way, used that opportunity, even though we did not know if they will win the elections or not. But that was the only entry point we had. So we would invite these leaders from the opposition to all of our conferences or workshops or private meetings or events. And I think that turned out to be successful. because they won the elections with very, very small majority. They had actually only one extra member of parliament in their coalition. So that's very weak majority in the parliament. But again, immediately after elections, they would come publicly in support of LGBTI. The first that showed up, it was the Prime Minister, and he came on the birthday of LGBTI Support Center. For those that don't know, LGBTI Support Center was previously 6 times attacked, put on fire, demolished. We were attacked inside on a couple of occasions. We were like 40 people inside, etc. And none of these attacks was solved. So the Prime Minister came in solidarity of everybody who survived this attack. However, in his speech of solidarity, he never mentioned LGBTI or sexual orientation or gender identity, but we did not crucify him for that. What we say in public, we were politicians in a way, not queer activists, because as queer activists we would criticize that, but as in a way fighters for advancement of the law, we said, the Prime Minister came to LGBTI Support Center and stood in solidarity with us. We had several occasions like that, but one important is that in the same year after the elections, we had conference on access to justice, where it was the first time in the history the Minister of Internal Affairs, the Minister of Police, to attend on that kind of event and publicly in front of everybody to say that me as a minister, I will dedicate myself to change the criminal code to recognize hate crimes on the grounds of sexual orientation, gender identity. And he did that. Of course, this is not only their political will. This was followed to, for this to happen, we have organized countless of meetings, some private, some public, some with help of ambassadors, some with help of international members. But what we did was we tried to put ourselves in a shadow and put them in the spotlight. Instead of saying, this happened because we delivered 50 meetings and we took them to so many conferences and this and that happened, we said, no, they are leading the process. See, this government, they want this for us. And I think for them it was important to present themselves not as good political party in the country, but also as the leaders in the region. And that was the narrative they were using, and we were also supporting that narrative, that North Macedonia is the leader in the region for LGBT rights. And I think we managed to push some legislation, to push forward some legislation. One other important aspect is, and this is more about sustainability level. In the same period, 2 years before that parliamentary elections in 2016, we started working also with potential members of parliament. Not just with this political party, but other small political parties. Particularly, we targeted the Green political party and Liberal Democrats, because they are small and usually they go where the government is. So whoever is in power, they would be in their coalition because there are 1 or 2 MPs, etc. And we started working with them and talking about establishment of a parliamentarian group on LGBTI. So until the election happened, probably we had 10 or 15 meetings. After the election, when the parliament was established, we continued working, and in the beginning we had only 4 people. In our luck, it was that one of the members of the parliament, by the winning coalition, was an activist who, he was not LGBTI person, he's a heterosexual, but he used to work in LGBTI Support Center, and he was very vocal advocate for LGBTI rights. So that kind of helped for us to talk more seriously about this group. However, in the beginning, so the number is growing from 4 members of parliament to 6 to 7 to 8, but we still did not have members from the Social Democrat political party, which was the biggest governing party. And that was very difficult for them to approach, because they were still afraid that if they are so visibly under some LGBTI group in the parliament, that they will lose votes or they will lose respect from their voters in their cities. So our strategy then was to find a member of parliament from VMRO-DPMNE, this demo-Christian political party who would join, to put pressure on social democrats to say, see, we have MP from these people who are beating us on the street, but we still don't have from you, and you are social democrats, And we found one for Luisa. It was Rangelova, you know her. So immediately after that, 4 MPs from Social Democrats joined. It was like in the same day, almost. And that's how we established this group. In the beginning, it was functioning like non-formal, but we were pushing for formal constitution in the parliament to create sustainability, because this parliament will change, and what we will do. Luckily, we managed to do that. At the time, the president or the secretary, I think it was the secretary of the parliament, she gave us a room in a basement. I don't know, Luisa, if you were there on the constitution of the group. So the room, it was in the basement, but we did not care. We put rainbow flags, we invited the media, the ambassadors were there, we celebrated the constitution of the first, and they call themselves Inter-Party Parliamentarian Group on Advancing the Rights of LGBTI. We were lucky to have the coordinator of that group coming from the Green political party, who later she became the new leader of this political party, and I think her membership in this group helped her in her political party as well to become a leader, because she took the matter seriously. She first established very good cooperation with European Greens. She was working very closely with them to support her in this matter, but also she was working very closely with us. She was saying, give me the language. Give me the language, give me the arguments, and I will use that language in the parliament. So she pushed the matter very strongly, and she, even until after the establishment of the group, even without us pushing, she was pushing the LGBTI agenda in the parliament on her own initiative. And I think that is one of the biggest win that we have from that activity. But it's not easy, as I said. It's not like only the political will. We organized I don't know how many meetings, and also we were very tolerant and very adjustive to their needs. So we would meet in a restaurant, we would meet in a fancy place. I remember once, and we are NGOs. We have very limited budget. We had a meeting at one restaurant, and not the MP, but the driver of an MP ordered some wild meat that costed like 50 euros or something. And we were like, we don't have that money. But you could live through that. You have to live through that to establish that network, how can I say, to establish that trust. But also we noticed that many of them would take us for granted. Because of that, because we would always accommodate. And then our strategy was, on one of the workshops that we were organizing for them, each of us, of LGBTI leaders in the country, when we introduced, to also introduce all the boards and international settings that we are members of. So, for example, I introduced myself as a president of this network, and as a co-chair of that network that are international. And for them, it was like, aha, so these people are really smart, even though they are, local. So I don't know if this is important for you or needed, but I think for us, it kind of shifted the relationship. So they started looking at us differently. As you know, in 2 weeks, we will have elections, and we hope that, again, we will have this inter-party group on LGBTI that we will use in the future. I want to mention one more thing. I know that I'm over the time, but I think it's also a method that can be used in this kind of election. In the past, we also were sending questionnaires to the political party before the elections regarding the LGBTI people. So before the elections, we are asking them, why should LGBTI people vote for you? In the past, we were not receiving much responses. But on the last elections in the country, which were presidential elections last year, all 3 candidates answered to us. Of course, they shaped their answers based on their ideology, but they all answer to us, and somewhere on the margins in all of their answers, you could see that they would respect LGBTI because they are citizens like everybody else, and they are president, they would be president for everybody else. The candidate who won the elections, he came from the Social Democrats, and in his questionnaire, he said, yes, I support LGBTI people, blah, blah, blah. And one question that we had was if he will come on Pride Parade. Because last year, Macedonia organized the first Pride Parade. And he said, yes, I support the Pride Parade and I will come. 1 month later, he did not come. Then we publicly crucified him because he said he will come, but he didn't. So this year, for him to correct that, 1 week ago, on his own initiative, he invited all the LGBTI leaders in the country on a meeting to ask them, because we cannot have Pride Parade due to COVID, to ask them what he, as a president, can do. How he can advance the rights and what they think is the most urgent at the moment for advancing the LGBTI rights in the country. And of course, you know, this is mainly political event. It's not like he's writing the laws or voting on laws, but it's very important because it's shifting the, how can I say, the culture and the social understanding in the society regarding LGBTI people. 2 days later, 2 days after his meeting, the government published on their official website, on their official platform on Facebook, rainbow banner in support of Pride Month. Like, okay, we don't have Pride March this year, but we as a government support. And to end up, in conclusion, we are, of course, aware, and we have to be, as activists, aware about the pink washing as well. To what measure, you know, this is going in our advancement, and to what measure this is only pink washing? Because in Conor also mentioned this, I think, but in Macedonia, the Europeanization is very important. So Macedonian government wants to enter European Union, and they want to show themselves as they are advocating for LGBTI rights. However, even in their language, they're spreading they're still increasing the transphobic and homophobic narrative. For example, just recently, due to some court procedure, the prime minister, referring to one person who is not heteronormative or who does not fit in the heteronormative framework, even though that person have never ever publicly came out as LGBTI, the prime minister was like, I will not allow this faggot to ruin the government. And even when he apologized, because we had huge reaction on that, huge reaction, even when he apologized, he said that, I'm sorry, please LGBTI community, please forgive me, but I said this only as a character description, which was, you know, I'm laughing now, but because I survived the trauma. But so he went even deeper and deeper in that. Or, for example, when the criminal code, I've mentioned that it changed, but why did it change? The criminal code was open only for them to introduce some different articles in the law. So due to, we had this special prosecution that was supposed to follow the corruption cases. And for them to ensure the smaller punishment, they had to open the criminal code. And they did that change. But they opened the criminal code under umbrella of hate crimes and introducing SOGIs. So we are aware of this and we criticize this in public. So we would not stay shut up. And I must say, I'm very sorry that Israeli ambassador left, because I also had a question or a comment, because he talked a lot about the progressive LGBTI laws in Israel, but he failed to mention about Palestine. And he failed to mention that protection of LGBTI rights does not extend to Palestinian people. Because if they want the protection, they're forced by the Israeli government to either play double agent or to give a list of people who are organizing protests in Palestine. I'm sorry, this was very important for me to mention it publicly, and again, I'm sorry that he left and he didn't listen to this. So, in conclusion, we have to put a line. Yes, we can be politicians and we can push back and forth and we can be quiet for some things, but we cannot allow the pinkwashing to, how can I say, compromise, to erase us or erase fully our values that we stand. Thank you very much. I'm sorry I was over the time.
That was wonderful. Madloba, Didi Madloba, Biljana,
Thank you very
Dalen,
much,
Dalen
Biljana.
logiku red the midwa, training
And so it was, so the content of our speaker speeches were very logic, and so it was somehow close somehow the circle of issues, and it gave me provided me grounds to conclude that in any context, any place, international community, spiritual which influences the positive changes, the situation basically. So close cooperation with the political parties is very important. Of course, here we depend on context. In Georgia, it's not that popular to cooperate with politicians, and I believe that during the discussion we'll be able to speak about this. Our any communication with political parties contains risk because quite often it could be used for discreditation, discrediting civil society, such relationships. So we cannot do such freely this collaboration, and your advice would be really, really useful. How could we do this without being enemies as political organizations? Because there is huge risk for that, and protest, because you based your whole emotional speech tactic by saying that you were in street and protested, and then you started to speak how you sat around the table together with the politicians who later, with the help of international partners, helped you to achieve success. Thus, all your speeches were important for me, and I think that we can get lessons from all this. And now let's dedicate the last time. I apologize. I took much of your time, much more than planned. Now we have about 20 minutes to give opportunity to all our guests to express their opinion. I apologize, but of course, limit yourself and please try to somehow express your views in 2 minutes, for example, and please always remember that our main goal is to manage based on others' experiences, to agree on strategy, how to change political homophobia in Georgia, how to use the situation for positive changes. This is our main goal, and I believe that this is our aspiration. I see Georgia raising his hand, and please cue whoever wants to make a statement. Georgia, 2 minutes. Georgia, you have 2 minutes. I want to extend my gratitude for giving opportunity to communicate in Georgian language, because quite often even diplomatic sector operating in Georgia makes this mistake. For example, quite often an embassy of Germany does not provide posts in Georgian, and I would like to highlight one situation that Sophie and he half an hour ago still dared and protect us, non-governmental organizations, among them our moderator Anna Bashidze, and also ambassador of Germany made unpleasant speech, and it was about constitutional amendments, and it was he attacked ambassador of Germany as well. So our international partners promote so she mentioned that non-governmental organizations made statements which were not correct regarding us and regarding ambassador of Germany. So we and also she called people, she also insulted representatives of human rights. So it's very difficult to see such a person in the parliament. As for the speakers, they were very interesting, and I have really experience. So I have particular experience of cooperation with which I used to work in civil service bureau when I was 21 years old, and respectively I have some contact persons since then. Also during this government last year, I had a reception in Tbilisi, Secretariat in Tbilisi. We were absolutely newly established organization, and Deputy Minister also has really tolerant approach to LGBT people, and was a Deputy Minister of Healthcare and was very supportive. And also I tried to actively cooperate with all political groups existing here in Georgia, including among them are some politicians who are more active and openly state their positions in terms of facilitating LGBT individuals. Also, I wanted to highlight one circumstance that during this period I used to work with on issues of people with disabilities, and my organization does not have at the moment office, and we just were I am the only employee on voluntary basis. The only supporter of my organization were people who live in shelter with different nosologies and representatives of LGBT community. And during this COVID pandemic, this was for me very serious support, and I think that all social groups which are vulnerable in the country should unify, and this coalition should be established. So based on our difference, being different. Thank you very much, Bocha, for your good information and for your activity. You mentioned other groups as well, people with disabilities, other vulnerables. Also mentioned people who are growing up in public institutions. So mainstream principle is absolutely very important. We all are people, we are all human beings, and so our idea is different identities, so we work for almost everybody. So it doesn't matter I love such approach. I wanted to say a couple of words, please. Thank you very much. It was really interesting, especially Liliana's speech. Whatever she mentioned is absolutely relevant for our context. But the difference is that direction, and it's really important for this period to be really helpful for us. And I wanted just to ask a question: what was the impact of all this activity, and how did it change? everyday life of the community, of the community, and their social rights and life. And what was the difference between right wing and left wing political parties? So you mentioned some different parties, Greens party, Social Democrats. So these are basically, I think, left wing. But in Georgia, political spectrum basically is set up by right wing parties, and it's a problem for us to cooperate with them. So, so we have a rather difficult context. So I'm interested in this aspect as well. Thank you, Aya, Mariam also, and then Becca. I would like to greet you. Thank you very much for your interesting speech. So, activity of movements and ways of different countries are of course interesting. When we heard one approach step by step, or there are approaches, prides, radical movements, and I think that we should work, that we could choose this step-by-step approach to achieve progress with politicians, and I think that it would be correct if we take both approaches in parallel. I don't think that they exclude each other. In Georgia will find, I think that we have already found entry point. We are already in heart of the politics. We have already some working groups. We are engaged in different reforms, and some steps are already made forward, and there is a new process of meeting with politicians, and our work in this direction is already starting. And so besides and apart from the step-by-step approach, we can arrange political protest, rights, and so we need the internal approach and external approach at the same time. And so we get some reforms. There are some records made to code, but so this legislation is improved, but still there is a huge gap in everyday life. Aggression, acceptability, intolerance. So it's really huge, and mainly here we have the need for different type of mobilization. I think we need to be more visible in public space. Maybe it seems real in some just religious society, but I still think that triggering these issues will be really important, and I think that cooperation and work with communities is very important, and I think that we are making steps in this regard, and I think that there is interest from some strong parties, and I would like to agree that often for me it's somehow difficult to work with them on levels of principles, and sometimes I don't know, what are these parties doing with their other hands when they are cooperating with one, what kind of policies they develop, and maybe even are doing some or making some homophobic statement, but we still try to work with them to find particular solutions, to find particular agreements. This whole process is just started, and we hope that we'll have some results. There is an interest of their inclusion in our groups. Maybe they will make some public speeches, some public statements. Maybe they will include this LGBT issues in their programs. I thought this would be really helpful for us. Thank you, Mariam. Sorry, we are in a hurry, Becca, and Tanekatari. Welcome. I also support IS question regarding the parties and communication with parties is not just started. It happened. There are such experience with the Republican Party, for example. There is such experience. This is not something brand new, but since sometimes just a couple of people from these parties who met and communicated, they could not change the climate inside of the party. So, for example, even in Irma Inashuli's party, you can find one person who could say something positive about that, but this will never change whole picture. I am a bit skeptical if that whole political power spectrum is not engaged. And in our political spectrum, men are dominating, and these are not democratically managed entities. It's from top to bottom managed, and changes come from the centers. And in the centers, there are white heterosexual men. That's what I wanted to say. And one more thing, there are some dangers, huge dangers, especially when your name could be used absolutely incorrectly. And I would think for the 2, 3, 4 times before starting communication with political party. That's my opinion. Thank you, Becca. Of course, this concern really exists, and we all think about this, and we always have to justify why we are speaking with particular persons. So this is an issue on which we should think. Eka, please, the floor is yours. Thank you very much. I will do my best to be brief. I'm Thank you very much. Thanks to for organizing this meeting. I would like to say that we've been working on these topics and issues for such a long time that we communicated with almost all parts of it, a couple of them not, but most of them yes. And I don't think that it's correct to formulate that this cooperation starts right now and before it did not exist. So this success is the result of cooperation with the state. I think that if there is no effort of civil sector together with civil structures and public agencies, this success would never be achieved. So it's important to see the difference between cooperation with public agencies and other structures. For me, at this stage, it's very important to know that the politician who has political power and who is in the top leading the state, he should dare and have political will and make supportive statements, and not when this person is in opposition and comes and occupies my place on protest. Maybe you can argue with me, but I need politician as a supporter when he or she is in power. When this politician oppositioner comes to the protest or meeting, or of course it's okay, but it does not give me the same result as of support and statements of people in power. So this is very important for me. So I that's why I don't think that there's any use in speaking with politicians before they come to power, because quite often they say that this person is not homophobic, yeah, but then after coming in power, then to power, they make homophobic statements. So this double game, of course, impacts our rights and strengthen homophobia, and of course cooperation and transparency are absolutely important. So this political spectrum, we are right wing and left wing, is so mixed in our case, and so there is such a mess. It's very difficult for me to divide our politicians. Even programs somehow mixes, and so uh, so Georgian team felt representatives of which make homophobic statements when it was coming into power, was really tolerant and was really supportive. Yeah, so civil sector should be watchdog and always remind politicians their unmade kept promises. Thank you, Edgar. And I agree with you that we quite often are disappointed, frustrated, and political statements in many cases do not have any value, and people quite often do promises and never keep them. But even in such situation, we have just it's the only way just to gain somehow promises and then remind all the time. So you promise, and so thus I think that we should try to somehow to attack from all fronts before elections. So it's also very interesting topic, but we do not have time to cover it. But it's important to and interesting to think when shall we start only in pre-election period, or we shall continue then as well. This should be the circle. Who wants the floor? Georgi Tabagari wants the floor. Please, Georgi. I will add very briefly a lot is said, and I don't want to take much of your time. But basically, I agree with many of things, but so um, it's true that we do not have experience of good cooperation. It's clear, but if we do not accept that and say that something is being changed in this country, political establishment is also changing, and elections are also coming. So I think that we should still work. We should still work in advance with the political forces which are supposed to come in power. This is the only way. We do not have any other alternative. That's the point. So I think that we'd better to have promises instead of having nothing. And we, on behalf of Tbilisi Pride, plan to approach political parties, and I think I think we'll manage to somehow communicate with them. And May 17th, four political parties voluntarily made a statement and expressed their opinion for cooperating and meeting LGBT movements. So I think that Tbilisi Pride at least plans to work actively with all political parties, even if this remains just awareness raising activity. We still want to work with them. so approaching with our political agenda with people and talking with them about our concerns will be important, at least for high-level political parties. I think that for future we might have improved cooperation in new political settings. Today is changed. We have new constitutional system, and next year we'll have absolutely different parliament. And I think that it's really nice that we have hope that in a pluralistic new environment we'll have better opportunities to state for our interests. And I just hope that there will be some positive changes, because if we remain in the same reality and say that it was so 10 years ago when someone in European Georgia or in Georgian Dream made such a statement that there is no use in contacting politicians, then nothing will be changed. So I think that new approaches should be used. That's all from my side. Thank you. Thank you, Georgi Ben, please.
No, I didn't have a question. I was giving a thumbs up.
I just saw the hand, so I'm sorry. Okay. Who wants to share the observation?
I would perhaps give space to our three speakers if they have any questions before we have to wrap up.
If our speakers do not want to say something, or participants, then Eka wants to add, and then I will invite our guests to summarize and provide their recommendations. Eka, please.
I saw.
I propose to say that political homophobia becomes far more acute when redistribution of power starts in the country, and of what we still are moving to progress, but we should make effort to maintain peace. Otherwise, the achievement will not be solid. And I think that these elections will be very important, and it will provide a good spectrum, and there will be new way for political homophobia, but we anyway should use the chance. We should speak openly and not behind the closed door, not to leave anything for speculative approaches of politicians. Thank you. And thank you, Eka. Dear guests, do you want to say something? Your observations? Just summarize our brief.
I can say very briefly, just first of all, thanks again. I feel like it was great, experience here to hear all of your thoughts and to hear about the experiences in Georgia. So thank you for letting me listen in and share some of my thoughts. I would say that from what I heard a little bit, it seems to me that when I was presenting like insider, outsider, Czech Republic, Poland, like what's more relevant, seems maybe the Polish experience is more relevant, that you have kind of most parties more on the right. That sounds a lot like Poland. It's hard to find a way into the system. But I think, maybe the Polish experience can be helpful as well. As I mentioned, I think there is a pretty strong movement in Poland. I think one thing that that the Polish movement was able to do that really allowed it to become kind of political movement as opposed to just a kind of rights movement, but like a politically mobilized, electorally engaged movement, was finding other outsiders. So Poland was kind of lucky in a way that around 2011, a new party came into the party system that really challenged the established parties, and they built very close links with the LGBT groups. And so, I think when party politics is kind of unstable and new parties can enter politics, like that can be, it's a bit of a lottery, and you don't know if you pick the right partner, but it is possible in those circumstances perhaps to find allies that want to come into the social system. The other thing I would just say is that, I think the international dimension is really important, and I think when you are in the kind of position of having to use kind of the outsider strategy, the possibility of backlash is always present. It's really important that the international leverage is there to kind of make sure that the government, that the state can't repress, above a certain level. So I mean that's the big difference with Russia. So when Nikita is describing Russia doesn't have, it doesn't have to listen to the EU. The regime is quite undemocratic. There isn't a kind of upper limit on the repressive capacity of the government and the state against rights groups. So that's a real problem. And but it seems to me that Georgia is fortunate in that it's not that situation. And then I'd say again, I didn't say much about the situation in Poland, but if some of you have currently, but if some of you have been following, they just had elections yesterday in Poland for the presidency, and it was quite interesting because there were, on the one hand, the Law and Justice Party, which are the kind of social conservative party, was very, homophobic in its campaign and constantly kind of talking about the threat of homosexuality and worse than communism. I think Louisa mentioned that earlier on. But it's not entirely clear that initially it was thought that the Law and Justice candidate would win outright, but he didn't. And so now there will be a runoff round, and the main challenger is this mayor of Warsaw, Trzaskowski, who is famous for a year earlier implementing a kind of pro-LGBT policy for the city of Warsaw, and that caused a big controversy in the whole country. But it's quite notable that LGBT rights and the status of LGBT people in Poland is a major issue in the presidential election, and it didn't necessarily work for the social conservatives. It seems to, and I should also mention that one of the other candidates in the election was Robert Biedron, who used to be the head of Campaign Against Homophobia, which was that organization I mentioned before. So to me, the fact that two of the presidential candidates were sort of openly LGBT-friendly candidates is really kind of amazing, and sort of a real testament to how far the movement has progressed and become organized. So, and the final thing, I guess maybe I'd say is that, based on that, maybe there's another practical strategy here in thinking about like local level politics. So think about, Trzaskowski, this challenger in the presidential elections, as I said, he's the mayor of Warsaw. And it was in Warsaw, this big city, capital city with, higher levels of education and wealth, things that tend to go along with tolerance. Maybe this could be an area of focus. To focus on cities as kind of places to build pockets of organization that can then become sort of staging grounds for a more national level campaign. Because it does seem to be something that we see in Poland, a big difference between cities and countries. So again, thank you, and really a pleasure. I'll leave it to others.
Hot Nikita, Liliana.
Please, Nikita, Liliana.
I won't take a lot of your time. Just a few words I've kind of written down for myself. It's as we all noticed, the world is sort of exhibiting this strong trend towards authoritarianism, And unfortunately, Georgia is surrounded by those countries that are not strongly democratic and do not intend, or most of them do not intend to build democratic institutions. And I think this is a particularly interesting lesson for Russia, actually, because if Russians see Georgians, both male and female, as a very strong people, very conservative and very invested into family values. Therefore, it will be, or would be, hopefully will be, a very successful story, as Professor Odboyer mentioned, the international component here, because if Georgia succeeds, if Georgia succeeds in extending LGBTQI rights, then it will be a great example for Russia, for Russian people, for Russian activists to see that in a conservative society such as Georgian, visibility and human rights of LGBT individuals is possible. So, yeah, that's pretty much it.
Thanks, Ruth. So this week, when people inspire each other, we listen experience of others. We also want to be examples for others. So, Diana?
Yeah, I wanted to answer the question that over there to me about the political parties. I think it's a very important question. Probably in my presentation I didn't manage to include it, but the situation in Macedonia is not so far away. Even these social democrats, if you analyze their program and the language, they are not left organization. They are far from there. They're more central, let's say, at best. How can I say it? But on the question about working with political parties, my answer is for us to define where is our red line. Where is the red line that we don't cross? So, for example, the Demo-Christian political party, who hold that authoritarian regime for a lot of years, even tomorrow they come back in power because they did not transform in type. They're still Nazi-humanists. They are not just homophobic and transphobic, but also they're anti-Albanian. They're ethnocentric. So I wouldn't work with them because working with them, I'm legitimizing them. For me, or for the LGBTI movement in Macedonia, that's the red line. So with social democrats, we could work because even though maybe they are still homophobes and transphobes, but they want to shift, or they show that political will that they are want to shift in a way. So for me, that is the answer. And of course, I do not know the context in Georgia. So I don't know if it's smart, as Zeka mentioned, is it smart to start working while they're in opposition or not, as Zeka said? I don't know that. That should be decided with LGBTI people in the country. But in the Macedonian case, that shows to be very fruitful. Because when they're in opposition, they're not so powerful. And we could build trust, in a way, in that period of working. We could build relations. It was easier to hold them when they were in power. Because we built that relationship when they were not. How can I say? And on the first part of the question, what has changed? I already mentioned the establishment of this inter-party parliamentarian group on LGBTI. Additional thing that changed is that with this government, more and more LGBTI people, civil society people are invited in a working group for drafting legislation and in the working group for drafting national strategies, etc. There are several councils established for work with the government, cooperation between CSO and the government, and we are invited. And also in addition, the most recent survey among LGBTI people that was conducted by FRA, Fundamental Rights Agency from European Union, showed, if you compare the data between now and I think less than 7 years ago, you see slight improvement in the standards of LGBTI people, in the status of their rights in the country. But instead of that, I want to tell you something else. I remember after the first show up of the Prime Minister at the LGBTI Support Center, we had a case of trans boy, young boy who is a trans, and to tell to his mother to come to us for us to help him about his transition, etc. And she was like, how can they help you? No, not to us, I'm sorry, I confused. To come to the Prime Minister, Zoran Zaev, to help him with the transition, because now he's in support. And I know that this is like a children's story. It's not maybe relevant for you, but for me it's very important, because for the LGBTI people who are in a small town, maybe with limited access to information or internet or medicines or everything, this kind of public support in a way shows them that they're not alone with their four walls, that there are some politicians that maybe they will move things forward. I know that this is naive, but for me it's also important to believe that with this kind of public political support, we also change the hearts and minds, and not just of that boy, but also the general public. And with this example, I will end. During the organization of Pride Parade last year, we had a huge amount of hate speech. The hate speech on, of course, homophobic, transphobic hate speech that was present online last summer, these days, it was much higher than the hate speech before all of the 6 hate crimes attacks against us. So, but what was different is that the speech of support was even more higher than that. And that was absent only a few years ago. And I'm not talking support from ambassadors, because we had that in the past, but they are foreigners. And I'm not talking about support from NGO people or human rights people. I'm talking about broad, massive support from the public. And that would never happen 2 years ago. And for me, that change is more important than these researches and these bodies. It's tangible, it's visible, and I want to hold on that. So for now on, I will still maybe compromise a little bit, but I will continue to work with Social Democrats because they see some progress. But as I said, my red line is not to work with these other political parties who are very loud, nationalist, homophobe, transphobe, everything that is different, anti-Muslim, anti-Albanian, ethnocentric, etc., etc. So that is my message. And again, thank you very much for inviting me. It was nice to see the familiar faces, and I'm always happy to talk about these issues. So thank you very much for giving me the chance to do that.
Thank you.
Thank you. We are going to summarizing. I think that we achieved our goals. We all agree on one thing, that we continue our joint work and our strategies, our guidelines, definition was very interesting. Of course, we shall agree on these deadlines, and this will make easier advocating particular issues either inside or outside of program, publicly or inside of closed doors. So it will decide this later on together the civil society. But I personally think that if we manage to agree on key topics, we all in our country who work for many years on improvement of community life quality. We already started some dialogue, but we never stopped monitoring inside and outside. I think that this will be a precondition for success. So I wish you success. Now we can have arrange more detailed conversations. We still have several months. We are in the pre-election phase, and these elections might be the most remarkable in terms of joint advocacy for 3 important issues. Thank you very much. Thanks to organizers. Thanks to guests. It was very early morning for you. Thank you very much for inviting me. Thanks a lot.
I can jump in with just a few closing words too. Thanks.
Sorry, sorry.
Not to prolong, but I think it's been a great discussion, and thank you very much. Just to thank our speakers, and Biljana. You know, I think our two speakers were able to set the scene, and also the Israeli ambassador, to the sense that change happens, and it can happen slowly, it can happen quickly, it can happen in spurts, it can happen in different arenas, but it does happen. I was particularly, as someone who studied Poland for a long time and has been very, very depressed about where Poland has wound up. I was studying from 1989 on, or even before. This idea that, okay, this is very negative, the rhetoric and use of LGBTI, sort of idea of gender ideologies threatening us all, but that at the same time it does give big comments, the issue to say, and I do also take heart from the result of the election that things are trending in interesting ways. So really thank you for the scene setting, and then Biljana for these very, very practical, components of how to work. Some things do work, some things don't work, but I would take away things like questionnaires. Why not send a questionnaire to all the parties, all the politicians, ask them for their views in similar way that you did? What do we have to lose in that? And I just to say that I leave feeling, I think we have no option but small steps, but okay, small steps, we can do a lot of small steps and a lot of different small steps and try to achieve progress. And I leave the discussion, I wouldn't say feeling hopeful, but certainly less hopeless than I have in the past. So I think, we do sense opportunities with this changing electoral climate, and as both Eka and Connor were saying, this electoral ferment, it brings new threats, I think, as you say, because this is where the anti-LGBTI philosophy ideology is mobilized, but at the same time, big opportunities with, potential new allies and maybe new political forces, new political parties, or splinters of old political forces trying to gain traction, and opportunities there. So really, thanks for a very, very productive, insightful discussion, and I do leave feeling less hopeless than earlier. So thank you, and we'll look forward to organizing the next one. Please do send us suggestions for topics, but I think we'll count on our speakers here, and Biljana as our welcome encourager for practical. I have to say, having lived in Macedonia, I do remember from one day to the next what changed was an end to state-sponsored violence against LGBTI persons after the election of 2017. So things do sometimes change in big degrees. Thank you. And we'll see you soon. Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Anna, for moderating. And thanks, everybody, for being with us.